because we're in these roles that we always want to be there for other people. I've seen this everywhere, but the inability of leaders to look at themselves. And that's why I say self-awareness is one of the greatest assets of leadership, and the lack of is one of the greatest leadership liabilities.
Hello, my friend, and welcome to this Wednesday episode of A Call to Leadership. I'm Dr. Nate Saul, your host, and I'm so glad you are here. Every Wednesday, we have an expert join us in a different area of leadership, and this is an important episode on the crisis in leadership, in community, in family, in civic circles, in industry. So I've invited a very special guest on the program for a two-part series to address this leadership crisis. Matthew Brackett, who will share parts of his evolving leadership story with courage, with compassion, with inspiration. Let's listen in. Matthew Brackett, so glad to have you on the show, all the way from Mexico City.
That's right, Nate. Great to be here and share the mic, share the screen with you, with your audience.
Yeah, man. It's been so wonderful getting to know you. And then the bonus blessing is not only do we have kindred spirits on our desire to help people, but we're also very focused on the academic and, of course, applied concepts of leadership. You just completed a degree. Am I right?
I did, yes. Master's in the psychology of leadership at Penn State. So, yes. I don't have a PhD like yourself. But
you're fresh, man. You know, that thing about when you're just getting done with any degree, right? Your brain is so fresh with all of the concepts and everything that you've been going through. So, and, you know, we've talked about this a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about your background, but just to get the listener kind of primed for our conversation, this conversation around what you and I have both seen from an academic perspective and a practitioner perspective is crises. You know, it's been said that leadership has been in crisis for many years. In fact, when I started doing my educational journey, this was the first thing I learned, is that leadership is in crisis. I'm like, could it really be in crisis? And then the more I learned about the different areas of leadership that are in fact in crises, whether there's business crises, you see this in corporate America and corporate world, companies with scandals and issues across the swath of history. You see it in politics, right? You see all different kind of political crises that people, we don't have to even go through examples. People just can imagine and understand that every day they're experiencing a disparage in what's expected and what's actually delivered in families and in communities and in religion, all these different areas. And so you and I, and many of us in this camp, we want to stand in the gap. We want to be able to not only share encouragement and hope, but also provide tools and resources to the listener who says, you know what, I want to be a part of the change that people need to thrive and to serve so profoundly that we can cause the kind of transformation that people will get behind and reach a better future state. So I know that that's your heart, and I know that's my heart too, but that's not where you started.
That's right. That's not where I started.
Where did you start?
I started in small town New England, the 10th of 13 children.
Wow.
And then we were educated in an atmosphere of a lot of generosity. My parents were very generous. They taught us to be generous. They taught us also to want to make a difference in the world. And because of our faith background, also to make a difference in time and in eternity. And a side note to that is when my dad died not too long ago, and one of our last conversations was about how he had a lot of children, and he said that was the biggest difference that he could make in the world and in eternity, because his kids will live forever, which really struck me as a profound phrase. Yeah. But so we grew up with a lot of generosity and making a difference, and so that led me to making a decision to go to seminary and to being in the space of formal ministry as a Catholic priest, where I was for 30 years. 10 years of training and education, 20 years of ministry, part of that also as Navy chaplain. And
Thank you for your service.
Thank you. Then I stepped away from that 2 years ago, did this degree that we just mentioned, and started my own practice around leadership, really coaching people in leadership roles at that intersection between the personal and professional, so that they can lead better, love better, and live better. And I do that through the personal coaching, mentorship, and consulting roles, and then also through education, conferences, speaking engagements, workshops and things like that.
Wonderful.
But,
what a varied experience.
yeah, well, and ministry brought me to so many countries, which was also very fortunate. You know, I was in Italy for a number of years, in Ireland as well, in Colombia, in Chile, and I was able to work with and lead people from I would say all the continents, and then also just from, I don't know, 30 nationalities all at one time, just leading different people. So a lot of international, intercultural experience. So even that the diversity space is very important for me because of my experience. And I guess best, why do I do this and why do I do what I do is because I'm very passionate about the human person.
Mm.
I'm very passionate and in love with the complex beauty of the human person, or the beautiful complexities, however you want to say it.
Yeah.
Right. And then that shows up in leadership, and how we lead ourselves. When I speak about leadership, it's how we lead ourselves, how we lead those around us. In other words, how we exercise positive influence towards reaching goals with those around us, and then how we lead in organizational or institutional contexts.
That's beautiful. And you mentioned the priesthood, and I'm sure listeners interested in interestingly, I don't know if you ever get this or not, but of course you remember we're of the generation where we remember the movie Saturday Night Fever. If you recall that movie with John Travolta, right? The epic movie, and of course one of the characters had a brother who was a priest, and he was no longer a priest, and everybody was sort of fascinated with this individual who is no longer a priest, right? And so, you know, not to spend too entirely much time on it, but I'm sure someone listening is interested in your journey as it pertains to leadership. You know, what did being a Catholic priest teach you about leadership, perhaps in ways that were positive, and also perhaps ways that you learn from things not to do as you teach this important aspect of the human condition.
Right. Thank you, Nate. Well, there's so much we could say there. So, I'm very passionate about leadership and about the human experience, because leadership will always be part of our human experience, and always has been, as long as humans have existed, and it always will be. And we're not going to change that. And leadership, positive, healthy, wholesome leadership, is very life-giving in whatever circumstances it happens, in whatever context, whether it be personal and professional. But also leadership when it's not healthy, when it's dysfunctional, or to the extreme of toxic, it is very destructive. Mm. Then when we bring that into certain contexts, whether it be family contexts, whether it be faith-based contexts, the life that can be brought from good leadership is so much more, but also the destruction, it touches the deeper fibers of the human person. So that's why when people have experienced dysfunction in family, it touches them in a much deeper way. When people experience dysfunction in faith and in faith institutions, it touches the deeper fibers of their being and of the relationship with the transcendent and with themselves. That also gets me very passionate, because it's so important, right? And in those environments, and if we were to speak about those two, we can also speak about the political, which has such an influence on the social context and on all of us as human beings. But families, that's another reality that we're always experiencing as human beings. Okay, these are, in faith and family, these are sort of sacred environments where we are meant to be nurtured and to grow. So when the opposite happens, very hurtful.
Yeah,
it's very hurtful. And so, going back to your question, there's so much we could talk about being creepy. It does cause a lot of curiosity in people, you know, because then I worked in Rome and I was, you know, very involved in the Vatican, and so people,
yes,
that creates a lot of curiosity and intrigue around that.
I just learned recently that as I understand it, the Vatican is the smallest country.
It is
on the planet. I didn't know that. My son, who's a homeschool kid, he's like, "Dad, did you know what the smallest country was?" And I'm like, "I don't know." So it's interesting. Is it like an eighth of a square mile or something like that? Or something like that.
Well, like a little more than that, but yes,
maybe,
but it is smallest
square miles. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I was involved in that. You kind of get an inside look into just that. So that causes a lot of curiosity. And then living as a priest is a very unique lifestyle. So anyways, that's probably maybe a story for another day. But there's so many lessons, and that's probably something I want to bring to a podcast, or I want to bring to my own lives, about what life was as a priest, what I did, the preparation for the priest. Because really, I went through years of a lot of academic, not only academic, but spiritual training, years of living in silence, years of deep meditation, introspection, really, growing in the life of the spirit. But without getting into that, there's so much that we could talk about that. So your question was about leadership, I suppose, as a priest.
As a priest, as far as some key leadership lessons. But even then, I mean, I think it's a good place to start in terms of preparation. I mean, leadership involves much preparation, and many people, someone listening today, recognizes that, boy, I am not in a position of influence, right? Because we know that leadership involves influence,
Mhm.
and there's preparation involved to become a person of influence. And there's discovery involved. There's self awareness and reflection involved, and it's not light. Not a light journey that you took. I mean, this is a commitment, unlike most others, I would suspect.
Yes, it is. And we take vows when we live in community. At least I was part of a religious order. Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans. That's what I mean by the word religious order. And we live in community with the vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which are taken very seriously in supposed imitation of Christ. All right. So yeah, and I'm not sure where to bring this. There's so many things we could. First of all, is stepping in my path, my journey. I had a lot of minor leadership roles. I think there's two things I could say. That I was really grown into leadership, but I wouldn't say it was necessarily intentional. I was put into these minor leadership roles, and there was the vision. Although they didn't tell me, the vision was they saw me as high potential, and so they would give you these responsibilities and kind of give you opportunities so then you would grow into more senior roles, and which is essentially what happened. But I'd never really received formal preparation for that as such, and we can see that in a lot of spaces in the corporate. I see it in work in the military. We can see it in faith based. We can see it in so many sectors. Is people end up because of the traditional sort of promotional scheme, you end up in these roles without the necessary preparation. And I think that's it's a blind spot that a lot of people have. We sort of put people in these positions because we need them. And I coach people in leadership roles, and I was just talking to someone the other day where they take it. It's kind of interesting because they take it as, well, it's a sort of a compliment that they want to put me in this role, but it's also a necessity and an emergency. Okay, so it's kind of nice that they want me to do this, and then so a lot of people just step up, right? And they don't ask questions. They don't say, "Wait a second," because it could go sideways. And then who's the one that usually pays the price if it goes sideways? It's that individual. It's not the company or the organization, right? So people really have to stand up for themselves. Say, all right, if you wanted me to take this role, and I thank you for valuing seeing me as having the potential to do this. But what are you going to do to help me prepare better to live this role? So that doesn't always happen. So if someone takes it as a compliment, as this is great, it's sort of a promotion, so I will step into it. But the organization is sometimes doing it because they're in an urgent or emergency situation where they need someone to occupy that space.
Yeah.
And so there's not a lot of intentional growth. And I don't mean, because I know in a lot of organizations, there is a lot of wonderful intentional growth of people. There's a lot of development of high potentials. There's a lot of intentional, conscientious leadership development. So I don't mean to kind of say across the board that this is what happens.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting too. You bring up the family earlier and the preparation piece. I'm curious what your family support was as you entered into this season of preparing and entering into the priesthood.
Right. But we grew up and this is very interesting because it's interesting you bring this up because in my family, we had a big family, but my parents were very intentional and conscious about growing us, educating us in responsibility. And they bought the house, they owned it, but we took care of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
and it was this sort of like this co-ownership, right, of taking care of the gardens, taking care of the lawns. Then they got animals, they got 2 horses and sheep and chickens and
oh, fun.
It was, but not because we needed it, but because it was a way that they would educate their children and being responsible, right? And also creating this playground where their kids could, where they wouldn't have to go to look anywhere else to kind of have fun, but they could. We lived on a few acres, and we could use our creative minds to just make everything there into a playground. With the trees and tree forts and tree houses and animals but from a very young age, we were taking care of these animals. We were shoveling snow. We were cutting grass, and then on the weekends we had to work somewhere else in an orchard or a strawberry farm and things like that. I was working from the age of 8, being carted off to a strawberry farm to weed and then to prune and then to pick strawberries. My older siblings worked at an orchard from very young ages, so that the whole sense of forming us in responsibility. And I think when I look at all my siblings, everyone's been very successful in jobs partly because of that education.
And so discipline and your formation of the responsibility, it seemed as if this is something probably that someone listening needs to hear this, including myself, because we live in a world today, as you know, many people want to give less responsibility, and of course, then people have more sense of entitlement at times, and where I grew up in a very similar environment, except much smaller family. My mom was single mom for a long time, just the two of us, and same thing. Very, very. My mother was very focused on responsibility and working together, and that created a ethos, if you will, right? Principles based on contribution, significance, and not waiting for someone else to make the decision for me to actually go and do and complete. Is that similar to your experience?
I think so. Yes, I would say so. And my parents, and going back to what you said, I think people that go through, my parents lived through the Depression, right? But there's a lot of parents that they want to I don't want my children to go through what I went through. Right. And so they kind of bring it, then they swing to the other extreme, which ends up being destructive in my view, or unhealthy. Right? Yeah. So, well, yes, maybe to give them better circumstances, but don't take away the opportunities that they have to learn everything that you learned.
Yes.
Right? I'm not speaking to you.
No. I'm with you. Yes. And I think we can distinguish learning, discipline, responsibility from struggle. People say, well, I don't want my kids to struggle the way I did. And that's admirable. However, there are some benefits to struggle if we orchestrate it in a healthy and positive way.
Right.
In a familial environment. My son, for example, wanted to start a video game to sell. And a listener or two may have heard this on previous episode. And he said, Dad, I'm going to do really well because you're a successful entrepreneur. I said, well, it's not a guarantee. Even successful entrepreneurs don't always get it right. And so he ran his video game, and he had developers, and he had all these different aspects of it. I said, I'm going to help you, and I'm going to teach you. There's aspects of your business that you're going to learn on your own, and you're going to grow, and there's going to be pluses and minuses. And anyway, so the project .1 didn't work. It failed. And he was very upset. And he said, Dad, I don't know why, this failed. I said, well, the project failed because it was not designed to succeed. It was designed to teach you. Mm-hmm. It was designed to teach you about some of the mechanics of entrepreneurship and business. And so the things he learned about, he said, I asked him the top things he learned. And he said, well, one is everything with your contractors, get it in writing. Don't ever give payment before the work is complete. No matter how long you think it's going to take, double or triple it. No matter how much money you think you'll need, double or triple it. And so he's going down this litany list. I said, son, this is MBA level education here, right? And for the $600 I invested in your company as your angel investor, it was worth every single penny. And he's never forgotten the responsibility involved in that. I want to make sure we frame that properly, right? Because that's the key. The key is, how can I teach the next generation, or whoever I'm leading, to embrace and not only take ownership, but believe in the potential. You mentioned the opportunity, because I do believe in equal opportunity. I don't believe in equal outcome, because outcomes vary no matter what the opportunities are.
Right.
Yeah. And as your outcome has as far as different stages of life, right? It's your outcomes have been different than others, and so to bring this full circle back to the movement into priesthood. I mean, you've got a monumental commitment. You've learned discipline. You've learned responsibility. So you go into it. What were some of your expectations going into the priesthood?
Into ministry as such. That's a good. I have to do some memory. My expectations. I have to say, from day one, from even just before I joined, some of my expectations was that it was going to be very challenging, and it was. But it was also very beautiful. But I think some things went beyond my expectations as regards the impact that you can make in people's lives. First of all, the access that you have to people's lives, which then you're sort of given this access, but then to maintain that access in an environment of great trust, and that's not a given. That's something that you have to earn through the quality of ministry and services that you offer. But I think that I just the amount of experiences I had, just being invited into many people's lives, and usually you're invited into people's lives in the bright spots and in the darker spots, and to truly walk on that sacred ground. So that was, and then I got moved to different countries, and so just the cultural experience. When you minister in different cultures, you're not there as a tourist, but really you become part of the fabric, part of the cultural fabric, and that was also very fascinating. The language, and then just everything, the idiosyncrasies of every culture, and learning how to minister to people in each culture.
Yeah,
because it changes from culture to culture, from language to language. So I knew it was going to be hard, but it also went beyond my expectations in regards to the vast amount of experiences and the people that I've met, and I'm really very fortunate in so many ways. And when in that position, you're also invited into a lot of spaces. I talked about the Vatican. I was at the filming of The Passion. You meet a lot of, meet a lot of people in the political and diplomatic and then corporate space, because you're the priest. And so now when I step away from that, then a lot of those doors close, right? Because I'm just Matthew.
You mentioned something that's really important, and that's the word access.
Mm-hmm.
And I love how you describe it, because you describe it in such a way as it's a privilege and an honor to be invited into access to an individual's life. And this is leadership. Sometimes in different contexts, there's different varying levels, as you know, of access, personal and professional. And I think it's a two-way street with access. I think the one part is we are invited to in access into someone's life. And then, of course, as leaders, we also provide access as guides into a place that perhaps arguably someone who's following would not have access to otherwise. And that is in terms of our unique genius or our unique giftings as leaders, right? Because each of us will inevitably do leadership. And even if it's incrementally different, it's in a different way. It's based on our own. It's based on our own style and our own vision and our own within the parameters and within the foundational requirements of that role with that institution or that group. And so that access piece is such an important part of the conversation on leadership, right? Because we must not gloss over it. We must not take it lightly. And I love how you put it in a very not only succinct but instrumental position, right? It's an instrumental position of access and this is back to the crisis of leadership as we unfold this conversation, because that access is it is such a, and you mentioned the word sacred. I would argue that it is, whether it's in religious context or whether it's in non-religious context, it is sacred ground to lead.
Yeah.
Am I overstating that?
No, I don't. No, I don't. I use the word sacred. I don't want people to think of it as a religious term. I think it's a term that we can kind of relate to anyone, even if people that don't practice any formal or religion. When you think of something that's sacred, you think of something that's sort of consecrated, sort of like this
Set
revered,
apart, revered.
ground,
Yes.
set apart, revered ground that is treated with great respect. Right? And I believe that the human person is that, and that when we are invited, through a leadership role, right, or through ministry, or through family, or then into that sacred space is something that we should take very seriously. And so I use this expression. Maybe I've never used it before, but it is helpful. Because of a role, right, as a priest, but also a role in leadership, you are granted access automatically. But doesn't mean that you're going to keep that access. Right? It's what you do with that, right, and how you treat that influence and that leadership. And I want to go back to something that you asked about priesthood, and this is a negative aspect. Is a lot of times when I saw people in ministry that when they two things. First of all, they felt that they were entitled to that access. And secondly, that they would almost force people or oblige people that I have, because of who I am, I have access to that intimacy. And that's, no, you don't. Right? No, you don't. You also have to earn it, right? And so that's the abuse and aspects of faith, is where people in ministry begin to say, because of who I am, you have to do what I say, and because of who I am, I have kind of control over your life, and I have access to you. You have to share stuff with me, and that puts people, because it's in the faith context, put people under a lot of pressure on their conscience, which is again that sacred tabernacle in the human person. On the deeper fibers of the being, of the relationship with the transcendent. Then there's guilt, and then there's shame, and all these things that can be used as power over people. And that's an example. You asked me about an example in priesthood, right? And there's so many positive things, but how it can be used in a negative way.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, I just recorded an episode on positional power, or we call it legitimate power, of course, right, as you know from your studies, and I this is very timely, because speaking about this from an experiential perspective, right, that can be easily abused and misused, and it's only one power base, but it's one of the weaker ones, because it's simply based on your position, and it's important to have a position, but there are so many other bases of power which create healthy influence, rather than simply that one social base of power.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, when we're followers, we owe respect and obedience to legitimate authority, right? At least when it's legitimate, when they exercise that authority in the space that is granted to them.
Correct, and based on reciprocation, right? So it's an unwritten contract, and as I understand it, between obedience and safety.
Right.
Yeah, give me safety and to do what we have in our unwritten contract, and I will be obedient to your legitimate authority.
Your legitimate authority, right? Exercise legitimate authority, which I think is important. It's important for the whole, just for the functioning of an organization.
The continuity, yeah.
But it's also, well, people in legitimate positions, what they can't demand is they can't demand trust. They can't demand that you respect me on the deeper level. Sure, you have to show respect for me outwardly, right? But deep down, going back to my military experience, right? You showed respect, right? Courtesies, customs, and courtesies, even though you may have hated the commanding officer or your senior enlisted, right? But you were respectful to the position, not necessarily to the person.
Yeah, I'm sure people feel that way about the president if they're not in the military today. Many people say, I'm respectful for the position, but I'm not in favor of the individual, or perhaps the character traits of any individual president or leader for that matter. Yeah.
I think when we talk about the crisis of leadership, I think there's also a crisis of followership. And that's part of the conversation, is because of everything, the way leadership always happens in a context, as you well know. And society changes, and so the model of leadership, or the type of leadership, also has to adapt to social context and to so many other types of context. And that's really the art of leadership, is how to adapt, to adapt my leadership skills to what is needed in this situation, right? And now, and because of the way this, with this, the revolution of the '60s and this whole influence on freedom and liberty, right? There's been sort of an over influence on that, and so there's sort of like where this especially in the States, it's a very individualistic society, high on individualism, right? High on freedom, high on independence, which then makes it very difficult to follow, right? Then people have a hard time following rules. They have a hard time obeying. They have a hard time falling into these structures or constructs, because it's sort of like I am my own point of reference, right? And that can, when that's led to, in an extreme, that can really lead a society into a lot of chaos, because it's what we call, the sort of the dictatorship of relativism. Everyone has their own, in subjectivism, and so then everyone just sort of does their own. And so it's chaotic, right? And we can kind of see that a little bit in the country of how things are developing, right? But so that's sort of, there's a social wave of a lot of focus on freedom, on individualism, subjectivism, and all that's well and good, but all that always has to be understood in a broader context.
Right.
So, when we say that there's a Statue of Liberty on one side of the country, some people say that there should be a Statue of Responsibility on the other side of the country, right? Because everything sort of weighs between those two things. And then, also then with a lot of mistakes in leadership, so there's a focus on individualism, focus on freedom, and then because of poor leadership and abusive leadership, there's a rejection towards authority. And this leads to part of what we could call now the crisis of leadership. It's part of the pieces of that puzzle of the crisis of leadership. And then it's also people being in leadership roles that that sometimes don't know how to use their authority in a positive, healthy way. And we can talk about the reasons for that in a bit.
Yeah, I would love to dive into that. As you were in the priesthood, did you experience that? Did you experience personally? Was that in terms of individuals? Now, did you tell me? Well, I guess I should back up. You said you were at the Vatican and you were at different places. Were you responsible for a parish?
No, uniquely, yes. I helped in parishes, but was never responsible. I was responsible for seminaries. I was responsible for a lot of priests and seminarians. I ran a house for priests in Rome, which was under the Vatican. And you influence people in many ways, just by the fact of being able to preach, right? Speak in public. You have, and again, it's a whole nother thing. The great responsibility that public speakers have for their audience, right? And oftentimes that's used carelessly, whether it be in the faith space or just in our space, of coaching and all the other stuff, leadership stuff. There's so much public speaking events, and I think people use that stage also. We have to use that stage so carefully.
Yeah,
because people come to listen and they're gonna eat it up, and if you're not offering then accurate information, they're going to eat up the inaccurate information, right, and apply it to their lives. So we have to be very, very careful that so I didn't work in a parish, but again, I was always helping in parishes, work preaching retreats, a lot of the one-on-ones, so spiritual direction, spiritual orientation, spiritual guidance, spiritual coaching, whatever you want to call it. There's a lot of that. And then in the formation role, when you're working with people, whether it be priests or seminarians, you have a lot of influence. So, and again, we take that. So I witnessed, and to take that seriously, I didn't finish that sentence. To take it very seriously, I witnessed a lot of, because when you're in an environment where authority is given such importance, but then people also take a vow of obedience, that's a recipe for potential abuse. Right?
Yeah.
Abuse of authority, abuse of conscience, abuse of psychological abuse. So, and that happened a lot.
Yeah.
That happened a lot because people weren't trained properly in the exercise of that authority.
Now, when you look at, I'm glad you brought that up. When you look at general authority from a hierarchy, let's just use politics, for example. In a political scheme, you would say oh, it's the president's fault that this isn't happening. Now, of course, we know that many aspects of leadership are involved in decision making. Right. Or if there's an issue within a school system, then it's the superintendent should have noticed this. Right? We know that there's many pieces of this, and I bring these up as examples to ask the question: how does it work in terms of responsibility for the head of the Catholic Church, the Pope, when these types of issues are happening, in the priesthood? Is there this? Is it the same kind of focus? Well, the Pope should be doing more, or is that a farce to even utter that because of the type of obedience that's required in a religious setting?
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. I think, like our government, there's so many in the church government. There's so many layers, right? There's so many departments that sort of report to, and then a lot of information is filtered on the way up, right? So not necessarily, but just like not everything might get to the president, right? And it's the power of those lower filters. They have a lot of power on how they manage information, a lot of responsibility. And the same thing happens in the church. Now, but I think when we talk about ownership, I think when we talk about leadership and ownership as, and when I was in leadership roles, if something happened under my watch, there were mistakes made, even if I wasn't involved, it was mine, right? The mistake or the problem is mine. And so that's just the way I viewed it. And I came across that a lot in the military where, and that's why when you look at the military, when mistakes are made, who are the ones that lose command, right? Or it's the commanding officer, even if they didn't make the mistake, right? Or they weren't involved directly in whatever happened, but they were involved indirectly. And so, it's about taking ownership for what happens under me. I think going back to the church or to the political, I think, whether it be the Pope or the president, I believe that they can always do more, right?
Yeah.
And to be proactive in what they do, because they have a huge influence. But oftentimes we can get caught up in the bureaucratical side. And I would even say diplomats, people who are ambassadors. And you can get caught up in just the diplomatic side and the public relations and the networking and the bureaucratic side, and forget that because of your position, you can make such a difference in the world or in a country or in an institution if you are proactive in what you want to do.
Yeah, well said. So as you're transitioning and you're a part of this environment, at what stage do you start to consider leaving priesthood, and for what reasons?
Right. The transitions happen in life because of dreams, because of love, or because of pain. And mine had a lot to do with pain. So in my story, and I think it's something that speaks to a lot of people, and we won't go into it now, but just my whole concept of befriending pain. That pain is something that we want to avoid as human beings, but it also holds so much wisdom for us when we're able to sit in it and listen to it. Right. And I think if we go back to Viktor Frankl and his book about the human being in search of meaning, it's a lot about that, of what we do, how we allow pain to speak to us and to make us better. And this goes back to the initial part of our conversation around struggle and children and educating children and all that. So it was pain. I tried to, my first thing was that pain is telling me that there's something wrong with me. And so for a few years, I tried to figure out what was wrong with me. And I worked on a few things. So there were definitely things I could improve. I could improve on. But that didn't necessarily change. And so it was then brought me to the point where maybe it's the lifestyle that I'm living, it's the commitment that I made, it's the organization that I'm part of. It's all of that it just isn't the right place for me. It's very hard for me to really I resisted putting that on the table. Just so, when I think about people that are maybe have to go through divorce at some point, and it's something that they resist for a long time because it's something that you don't plan on, that you didn't make a decision, a commitment for that then to happen. Right.
Were you having conversations with other priests about this? I mean, did you have an inner circle? Did you have?
I would say it had all come came to a sort of a climatic moment when I started to go. I had a very deep assessment, psychological, mental, and emotional health assessment done. Um, and in that process, and in getting the debrief and the feedback and a lot of my assessments, was when I realized the gravity of my situation. I was trying to, sort of whitewash it, wash it over, and say everything's good. I can work through. It's not that bad, not that bad, as we all do, and a lot of people in leadership roles do. It's not that bad. It's not that bad, until we're all, where the ship is sinking, and we're still playing the music, and everything's good, right? And that was sort of it was that moment when I had to take ownership that I am not well. I am sick, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, right? And it was affecting my physical health with depression and just this. I felt like I was walking through quicksand every day. So it definitely had physical consequences. So that was a very challenging moment, but it was also a moment of the beginning of a path to light, into life, into freedom.
Wow. Yeah. Did you experience, I mean, was it a combination of external factors and internal factors that were causing this deep level of internal strife?
There were, yeah, definitely internal. Yeah. There was organizational things. I was part of inside the Catholic Church, which has its dysfunction, has also its beauty, but has its dysfunction. And then I was part of an organization inside the Catholic Church, which was highly dysfunctional. So I was with them for 30 years. And so that, I think when you're part of a dysfunctional organization, you become blinded to a lot of the dysfunction. And so you kind of live it, right, and breathe it. But at some point it begins to, I think I'm a forward thinking person, and I'm an innovative thinker, right? And that was not well considered.
It's not welcomed.
Yeah. So you're sort of living in conflict with the organization, with the institution, and you're sort of in that, because of the power of the organization, you're made to think that there's something wrong with you, or that you're going against the spirit, right? Or you're, by thinking differently or wanting to do things differently, you're being unfaithful. Right? This is a huge weight, and so you're living in conflict with that, and then that creates conflict with myself.
Yeah.
And then there was I think because of going through whatever I was going through, being in a very dark space, then I also turned to behaviors, whether it be what I would call unhealthy behaviors that we do to self-medicate our pain. Right, whether it be we consume things, we can consume, that's addictive behaviors, whether it be in what we consume physically or what we consume emotionally or mentally. Right, in my case, it would have been on the sexual side of pornography and things like that. Sort of a self-medicate, but that doesn't do it. It creates more shame, more guilt, more problems. And I'm not saying whether pornography is right or wrong. It wasn't a healthy go-to for me, right? Understandable in its context, but really not justifiable, and it didn't do what I was looking to ease the pain, and it didn't. My pain was increased, my confusion was increased, and so that's more internal stuff. And then part of it was also I didn't know how to deal with. I was always a point of reference for other people, which I was great at that. I think I did it really well, but I didn't have the muscles and the abilities to deal with my own stuff. I didn't know how to do that. And I think this is a common thing in people in leadership roles, because we're in these roles that we always want to be there for other people. And I've seen this everywhere. But the inability of leaders to look at themselves in the mirror. That's why I say self-awareness is one of the greatest assets of leadership, and the lack of is one of the greatest leadership liabilities. Right? But we don't realize, because when we're in those positions, we think that, oh, well then, we must be good and everything's good. Okay, so I had this great inability, and then it affected me, and it affected the effectiveness of my leadership. And I think this is part of the crisis of leadership, is the inability of leaders to look at themselves. That's why I really believe in coaching, in having someone else, because we need that ability, or that space in confidentiality, to be able to look at ourselves. And as human beings, because we are a mystery unto ourselves in many ways, we see ourselves or we discover ourselves through the eyes of another.
Mm.
In many types of relationships, but coaching is one of those, where the only thing that the coach, we don't, with a coach, you don't have any other relationship other than that coach. Really, in other words, the coach he's in my corner, he or she, they are there so that I can grow. And in the coaching relationship, we are forced to slow down. We're forced to stop and to pay attention to what's going on outside of me, and to pay attention to what's going on inside of me. And when you are forced to have that space, automatically you will begin to grow. And you begin to grow in self-awareness. You begin to grow in what's in your ability to see and to listen. And so going back to my own story, that began a journey of life-giving awareness, right? I was in a bad state, right? So I started intensive therapy, then I went to inpatient care for 4 months, and I began to learn to exercise these muscles that I didn't know how to exercise, of vulnerability, of being, just owning stuff, of honesty, of paying attention to my emotions and to what was going on. And it was a path of great growth. A lot of pain involved, but I think that's in the end, it was so beneficial for me. So I don't know if that answers your question.
It powerfully answers my question. So at some point in this journey, you're contemplating leaving the church, as far as in ministry, full-time ministry. Is there pressure for you to stay? What does that look like from your perspective? And
there is a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
Right? There's social pressure, there's spiritual pressure, there's institutional pressure, especially in that context. And I think in a lot of other faith contexts, people leave whatever, the Christian churches being a pastor, in the Catholic Church being a priest. There's always a negative connotation around it, and it creates a lot of ripples and waves. So there's a lot we could say about there around, the importance that we give to these roles and how healthy or unhealthy that may be. But the fact is, yes, there's a whole bunch, and that's why I put it off for so long, because we make this commitment to God and the church and to the people of God, and a commitment that we take seriously. And it was a commitment that I made for life. And so to kind of backtrack on that's a huge thing. Then the sense of failure. Well, I'm not good enough, or I'm not as good as I thought I was. This whole sense of weakness and failure and all that. And then there's I'm letting a lot of people down. I'm letting the institution down. Then, with my brother priest, then you're sort of viewed as a traitor. Maybe not that those words are used, but there's a lot of, it's an emotionally charged decision in many ways, in the way it affects other people. And people don't see you the same. You lose a lot of people. A lot of people step away, and just a lot of relationships change, which I suppose is natural, but it never means that it's easy or it's hard, or it's easy to kind of understand and take.
Takes a great deal of courage. Yeah.
Yes, that's what a lot of people say, and I've sort of grown to understand that, the courage that it took. I definitely didn't feel courageous at the moment.
You felt survival, right?
Yes.
But sometimes survival necessitates courage.
I think, and I had to learn to be assertiveness was not something I was always good at, right? And so I had to learn to exercise those muscles and and I began to realize that if I don't stand up for myself, no one else will. Like many institutions, and there's a whole another topic that we get into about when organizations call themselves a family, right? And how unhealthy and dangerous that is. And maybe that's a topic for another episode. Okay.
Indeed.
But it's I forget where I was going with that. Where was I?
We were talking about the courage out of having a survival.
Right. Well, learning to be assertive, because I had to stand up, because I realized that in the end, the organization, I'm not their priority. And in any organization, remember, even no matter what position you have, people are ready to move on from you, right? When it makes sense for the organization. And I've seen that a lot with my brother priests, right? Who have been put in those positions where the organization, the institution just walks away. So I had, then I sort of, and that's hard because it's, these are organizations, and then it happens. I was talking to someone the other day who was, had a high level position in Microsoft. He was part of the layoff, right? And it's so because you're on the onboarding process, you're brought in as part of the family, right? And this happens in so many organizations. And then a little bit later, you're no longer seen as necessary or useful, and so you're just let go, right? And that really doesn't happen in family dynamics. It's a professional relationship, it's a transactional relationship. Okay,
Yes.
so
Yes.
so
Interestingly, yeah, we'll have to have a conversation, a follow up about that, because there's some organizations who actually attribute the family environment. I don't know if you've heard of Barry Weimiller, but it's actually an institution out of St. Louis, and the CEO Gary Chapman. I'm sorry, not Gary Chapman. Bob Chapman is. Interestingly, we won't broach it today, but I'm going to put a pin in it because he's got some very interesting views on that entire dynamic. And you had mentioned about beyond the transaction into like the transformational space.
right.
But
And I
yeah,
agree. I agree. There's so many, but I just wouldn't use the word family,
yeah,
because it creates certain maybe it creates expectations that can't be fulfilled.
sure. No, I understand, especially in the church.
Right.
Yeah, especially.
So there's this high level commitment, and so when I realized that this institution in the end wasn't going to stand up for me, because in the end the institution has to stand up for itself, and then I had to stand up for myself, and I had to learn to be more assertive, and that was a path of great growth, and because in that environment, sadly, where there's a lot of codependency in the relationship with authority, and with the institution. And you're taught that when you stand, there's a whole thing around humility and then pride. And so if you stand up for yourself, so a lot of people feel bad when they stand up for themselves. And so I've been able to work with a lot of people. And it's not about making people rebellious. It's about teaching them to exercise these muscles of appropriate assertiveness for the good.
Agree. In fact, I I'm cut from the same cloth, if you will, of agreeableness as far as a number of instruments that I'm sure you've taken many
Right.
instruments on, personality instruments and different drives.
And
And
Big
so I
Five.
was big five, right? Yeah, I was high on agreeableness, and I've had to learn over time, as you said, appropriate assertiveness. Now, in certain contexts, perhaps it's innate, right? It's natural for you to exhibit that, but in others, it's perhaps uncomfortable yet necessary.
Mhm.
And I think someone listening today, this is resonating. This is hitting home because there is an appropriate assertiveness that's necessary to move forward in a healthy and responsible way that leads to a better future state for yourself and those who you are either leading or following.
Yes. Thank you, Nate. Let me explain appropriate assertiveness real quick, is the way I use those words very intentionally. Because it's about assertiveness is about respect for oneself and respect for the others, so that we're not stepping on the rights or the boundaries of others. But so it's the appropriate assertiveness to be able to stand. But oftentimes it can go, there's two extremes. One is we just let people sort of walk all over us, right? Which can be seen in some contexts as humble and holy. It's not, right? But it can be sort of interpreted that. Or it's the other extreme is I just walk all over people, right? Which is sort of it's more aggression, right? And all that stuff. So appropriate assertiveness, I think that's why I use those words very intentionally.
Yeah, it's a fantastic terminology, and I think it embodies a permission to move forward in a way that is best for yourself and best for the institution. Because at the time, you were likely, I'm going out on a limb, were not in a state that was best for the institution.
No, it's probably liability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you make the decision, and I love starting out our multi-part. This is going to have to be a multi-part series. We'll come back and do several more, and as a recurring guest, especially in the aspect of leadership, because this is important for the listener. This subject of leadership, it's so invasive. There's so many layers and parts to it, right? This subject has been alive as long as humanity. as long as life.
That's right.
And so this is an ongoing conversation that's so important. And I love how we start the conversation around your experience in the church. And I'm so thankful for your vulnerability to share some of those intimate challenges that were so difficult for you, so emotionally uncertain at the time. And because someone listening is saying, wow, that's me. I'm there right now. I'm in that place you were in, Matthew. And but you found a way. You found a way. And I love how you laid out all the different parts of this journey toward healing, toward wholeness, toward a new chapter. And that's the thing about life, right? It's, our lives are stories. And the way I like to interpret it, and you mentioned the transcendent, I tend to look at it like, we play supporting roles in this grand story, right? And each page we turn. In fact, there's an old song, you don't like how's it go? You don't like what's happening in your life or something like that. Just turn the page, right? Turn the page. You don't like your story. You don't like. I love that. Just turn the page, right? And so it's difficult though sometimes. Oh my goodness! Sometimes that page is so heavy. It feels as though it's made out of iron, or you just cannot lift it. And so you've got to be in a place to where you are capable, and you have built up enough strength, whether it's emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically, all of these different aspects of the human being, in order to turn that page. And perhaps you can't turn it alone. Sometimes you need help with others.
Yes. I had a lot of people that I turned to. A lot of people became very key figures in helping turn that page.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard for us as humans to turn the page because we like safety and we like the known, right? We know the page we're on. We don't know what's on the other page, right? Or the other page is blank and we have to write something like, oh boy, I don't know what we're going to write. So there's, we like clarity, we like security, we like safety. And sometimes turning the pages goes against those natural instincts of the comfort of that. Yeah. But there can be so much, there's resurrection on the other side.
Amen. Yeah, and that's part of this ongoing conversation about crises and leadership, is that the state that we're in, the page we're on, is not the end of the story. We can be difference makers. We can help author a new future state, right? We can. The way I like to say it, the expression is, we can suspend our current reality and invite others to join in creating a new reality, a new reality that is healthy, that is whole, that rejects toxicity and cancerous leadership, embraces leadership that truly serves the needs of one another in profoundly uncommon ways.
Right. So much that we can continue to talk about. But thank you, Nate. And I think two great topics that we can continue with is, and with crisis of leadership, but we could even say leadership in crisis, which has two meanings. It means leadership in crisis, but also leadership during crisis.
Yes.
Because those are, I think, two very important topics.
I agree. And this is a good cliffhanger, because our listener will want to know how and when you left. What were the next steps? We're going to save it for the next episode, because I think this journey is a very important backdrop to our continuing conversation around leading through crisis. Matthew, thanks for being on the program, brother.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you very much.
This is wonderful. I can't wait to see you again.
I look forward to part 2.
Well, my friend, we did it. I'm so honored you were able to join me on this episode of A Call to Leadership. Now, this might not be for everyone, because you really have to be in a certain place in order to take the kind of steps to level up your leadership. And I want you to be taking steps. If you feel like you're ready for something like this, you can go to our website, greatsummit.com. I'll make sure that's in the show notes. You and I will get to spend some time together and really focus on aiming for greatness.